Hey, stop scrolling for a second. I need you to hear this one before you do anything else today. A woman knelt on cold marble, scrubbing at a stain that wasn't hers to clean. Above her stood the woman in yellow silk, laughing, wine glass tilted, red liquid spilling deliberately onto the floor she'd just wiped clean. And in the doorway, unseen, unheard, stood the man whose name was on the deed to that penthouse, the man who was supposed to marry her in 6 weeks. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched. And what he did in the next 60 seconds would end an engagement, expose a secret, and change 3 lives forever. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Hey friends, welcome back. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told. About wealth, cruelty, dignity, and the quiet strength of a woman nobody thought to protect. It's got a twist you will not see coming. So grab something warm to drink, get comfortable, and let's begin. Nobody in that building knew her real story, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Her name was Adise Coleman, though everyone in the penthouse just called her the Maid. 34 years old, quiet, precise in her movements, the kind of person who noticed everything and said almost nothing. She'd been working for the Whitfield residence for 8 months, ever since she'd answered a staffing agency ad that promised discretion valued, generous pay, live-out position. She needed the money badly. Her son, Malik, was 11, sharp as a tack, obsessed with astronomy, and completely unaware that his mother sometimes skipped dinner so he wouldn't have to. The penthouse belonged to Julian Whitfield, 39 years old, CEO of a logistics empire his grandfather had built from a single delivery truck in Newark. Julian was not the stereotype people expected. He didn't flaunt his money. He drove himself to work. He remembered the names of the doorman's children. His late mother had raised him with one rule burned into his bones. The way you treat people who can do nothing for you is the only truth that matters. Julian believed that rule the way other men believed in gravity, not as a philosophy but as a fact of the world. Which was exactly why nobody who knew Julian could understand his engagement to Camille Foster. Camille was beautiful in the way magazine covers are beautiful. Engineered, polished, impossible to look away from. She'd met Julian at a charity gala 18 months earlier, and within a year she had a ring, a walk-in closet the size of Adise's entire apartment, and a wedding planner on retainer. Julian's friends had quietly worried. His assistant, Denise, who'd worked for the family for 11 years, had once tried to say something and been gently but firmly told to mind her own business. Julian was in love, or thought he was, and love, even the wrong kind, makes smart men blind. Adise had noticed things from her very first week. The way Camille's voice changed the instant Julian left the room, dropping from honeyed sweetness to something clipped and cold. The way Camille would test the staff, leaving a diamond earring on the nightstand to see if it would be touched, spilling coffee by accident to watch how fast someone scrambled to clean it. Adise had worked in enough wealthy homes over the years to recognize the type. She kept her head down. She had a son to feed. But it had gotten worse in the last 2 months. Much worse. It started small, a raised voice here, a snapped command there. Then Camille began finding reasons to summon Adise at odd hours, criticizing work that had been done perfectly, tearing apart freshly made beds to redo them properly, dumping full trash cans back onto floors Adise had just finished. Adise said nothing. She'd learned long ago that women like Camille fed on reactions the way fire fed on oxygen. Silence starved them. Or so she hoped. What Adise didn't know, what nobody knew, not even Julian, was that Camille's cruelty wasn't random. It had a very specific, very personal reason. And that reason was about to walk through the front door 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Julian had been in Singapore closing a shipping contract that would define his company's next decade. The trip was supposed to last 12 days. On day 9, the deal closed early. The kind of clean, decisive win that made a man want to come home and celebrate with the people he loved. He didn't call ahead. He wanted to surprise Camille. He pictured her face lighting up, imagined pulling her into a hug still smelling of airplane air, imagined finally feeling that certainty in his chest that he'd been quietly, desperately searching for since the day he proposed. He landed at 6:40 in the evening. By 7:15, his car was pulling into the private garage beneath his building. By 7:22, he was standing at his own front door, key already in his pocket, listening. He heard Camille's voice first, bright, theatrical, almost gleeful. Then he heard something that made his stomach drop before his mind even understood why. A sound like liquid pouring, and beneath it, a woman crying, trying and failing to keep it quiet. Julian didn't call out. Some instinct, some old warning buried deep in his chest, told him to open that door slowly instead. What he saw on the other side would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. Adiz was on her knees in the entryway, a broom in one hand, a rag in the other, scrubbing at a spreading crimson stain on the marble floor. Her shoulders were shaking. Camille stood over her in a yellow silk dress, a bottle of red wine tipped sideways in her manicured hand, deliberately pouring more of it onto the floor Adiz had already cleaned twice. Again, Camille was saying, laughing. You missed a spot, sweetheart. Did they not teach you how to clean where you're from? Julian's whole body went cold. And in that frozen half-second before either woman noticed him standing there, one thought cut through everything else in his mind with terrible clarity. How long has this been happening while I wasn't home? The mini-hook is unspoken. Julian's silence in that doorway would last exactly 4 more seconds, and those 4 seconds would tell him everything he needed to know about the woman he'd promised to marry. He didn't announce himself right away. Later he would feel guilty about that, about watching even for a moment instead of stopping it instantly. But something in him needed to see it fully, unfiltered, before Camille had the chance to perform innocence. Camille tipped the bottle again. You know what, just leave it, she said, feigning boredom now. I'll have someone competent fix it tomorrow. Adiz didn't look up. She kept scrubbing, jaw tight, refusing to give Camille the satisfaction of tears falling where she could see them. Yes, ma'am, she said quietly, the same 2 words she'd said 100 times before, the words that had become armor. Camille. Julian's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Camille spun around so fast the wine bottle nearly slipped from her hand. For half a second, just half a second, her face showed something raw and unguarded, something close to panic. Then, like a curtain falling into place, it was gone, replaced by wide-eyed delight. Julian. Baby, you're home early. I wasn't expecting. She crossed the floor toward him, arms already opening for an embrace, stepping directly over the kneeling woman as if she were furniture. Julian didn't move to hug her. He looked past her, down at Adiz, who had finally lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, humiliated, and terrified, Julian realized with a jolt, terrified of what would happen to her job the second her employer's fiancé finished whatever story she was about to tell. How long has this been happening? Julian asked. He wasn't looking at Camille. He was looking at Adiz. Adiz said nothing. Of course she said nothing. She'd learned that speaking up in houses like this one usually cost you more than staying silent ever did. It's nothing, Camille said quickly, laughing again, that same performative brightness. She's clumsy, that's all. She knocked over the wine and I was just showing her how to actually clean it up properly. Honestly, Julian, you're overreacting. Come here, I missed you. I watched you pour that wine, Camille. His voice was flat now, stripped of warmth. I watched you do it on purpose. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Camille's face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, calculation, and finally something harder, colder, the mask slipping just enough to reveal what lived underneath it. You don't understand what she's like, Camille said, her tone changing entirely, sharper now, defensive. She talks back. Slow. She's been stealing from us, Julian. I've been meaning to tell you. That's a lie. The words came out of Julian before he'd even decided to say them. Quiet but absolute. He crossed the room and crouched down beside Adiz, ignoring the wine soaking into the knee of his $3,000 suit pants. Are you hurt? He asked her gently. It was the first time in 8 months anyone in that penthouse had asked her that question. Adiz's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a single tear escaping despite her best efforts to hold it back. No, sir, she whispered. I'm okay. But she wasn't okay. And Julian, watching the careful, practiced way she wiped her own face and straightened her posture, as though bracing herself for the real punishment to come, understood with sudden, sickening clarity that this had happened before. Many times before. Denise, he called out, raising his voice toward the hallway where his assistant's office was, forgetting for a moment that Denise had already gone home for the evening. No answer came. It didn't matter. He turned back to Camille. Get your coat, he said. Excuse me. Get your coat, Camille. You're not staying here tonight. For the first time since Julian had known her, Camille Foster looked genuinely, deeply afraid. Not because she was losing a fiancé. Because she understood in that instant that Julian had seen exactly who she was, and there was no performance clever enough to undo that. What Camille didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Julian's next phone call, made 40 minutes later from his home office with the door locked, would uncover a secret about her that had nothing to do with wine stains or marble floors at all. A secret that would explain, finally, why she had chosen Adiz, out of every member of his staff, to torment. It wasn't random. Had never been random. This is the section where everything the audience thought they understood gets turned upside down, so listen closely. Julian sat in his home office that night long after Camille had stormed out. Her suitcases hastily packed by the driver he'd called to take her to a hotel. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't thrown anything. He'd simply told her, in a voice so calm it frightened her more than shouting ever could, that the engagement was over, and that she had until morning to arrange to collect the rest of her belongings. Alone now, he poured himself a drink he didn't touch and stared at his laptop screen. Something about Camille's face in that doorway kept nagging at him, that flash of raw panic before the mask went back up. It wasn't the panic of someone caught being cruel. It was the panic of someone caught being recognized. He opened his email and searched his own archives for the staffing agency's original placement file, the one listing every employee's name, background check, and reference. He found Adiz Coleman's file quickly. Standard information. Clean background. Excellent references from 2 previous employers. Nothing unusual. Then he did something he probably shouldn't have. He searched Adiz's name alongside Camille's, on a hunch he couldn't fully explain. The result that came back stopped his breath in his chest. 7 years earlier, in a completely different city, a young paralegal named Adiz Coleman had submitted a sworn affidavit in a civil fraud case, a case involving a wealthy family accused of falsifying financial records to defraud investors. The family's name was Foster, and the daughter named as a co-signer on several of the fraudulent documents, then 26 years old, was Camille Foster. Adiz's testimony, buried in old court records Julian had to dig through 3 different databases to find, had been instrumental in the case. She hadn't been the star witness. She'd simply been the junior paralegal who'd noticed the discrepancies in the filing dates and quietly, at enormous personal risk, brought them to the attention of the lead attorney. The case had settled before trial, the details sealed. The Foster family's public reputation only lightly bruised because their lawyers were excellent and their money was better. But Camille had lost something in that case that money couldn't buy back. She'd lost her fiancé at the time, who broke off their engagement rather than be associated with a scandal, and she'd lost for a while her family's trust. Camille had never forgotten the name of the woman who'd noticed those discrepancies. And when, 18 months into dating Julian Whitfield, His staffing agency had sent over a candidate named Adiz Coleman for a live-out maid position. Camille had recognized the name instantly. She hadn't said a word. She'd simply approved the hire and waited, savoring an opportunity for a slow, deniable, exquisitely cruel revenge that she could disguise as ordinary household frustration. Julian sat back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. It wasn't cruelty born of entitlement, though there was plenty of that too. It was something colder and more deliberate. A woman who had spent 7 years nursing a wound, and had finally found the person she blamed for it, utterly powerless, cleaning her floors. He thought about Adiz's face. Exhausted, dignified even in humiliation, refusing to give Camille the satisfaction of a single unearned tear. He thought about the quiet way she'd said, "Yes, ma'am," like it was a shield she'd built brick by brick over years of learning that survival sometimes meant swallowing your own voice. And he thought about something else, something that made his chest tighten with a feeling closer to shame than anger. She had been protecting people like me for years, and I never even knew her name until tonight. He didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., he made a decision that would set the rest of this story into motion. A decision that had nothing to do with guilt money or a token apology, and everything to do with finally, truly seeing a person he had walked past in his own home for 8 months without ever once asking who she really was. He picked up his phone and began writing an email to his legal team. Not about Camille. About something else entirely. Something Adiz didn't even know was coming. What happened the next morning changed the trajectory of 2 lives at once, and neither of them saw it coming. Adiz arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, as she always did, dreading the day ahead. She assumed reasonably that after last night's scene she would either be fired for causing a disturbance, the way these things so often went in houses like this, or forced to endure some awkward hollow apology from Mr. Whitfield that changed nothing about her actual situation. She'd already mentally rehearsed how she'd explain a sudden job loss to Malik, already calculated how many weeks their savings would stretch. She was not expecting to find Julian Whitfield sitting in the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee poured, gesturing for her to sit down across from him at the marble island Camille had bled with wine the night before. "Please sit," he said. "I want to talk to you. Not as your employer. Just as a person who owes you an apology." Adiz sat carefully, her guard fully up. In her experience, wealthy people who wanted to talk as a person usually wanted absolution more than they wanted to actually make things right. "I looked into something last night," Julian said, sliding a folder across the counter to her. "I think you should see this." Inside was a printed copy of the 7-year-old affidavit. Her own name, her own signature, staring back at her from a chapter of her life she rarely let herself think about. She'd been so proud of that decision once, so certain that doing the right thing mattered. Then she'd watched the case quietly settle, watched the foster family's lawyers smooth everything over with money and connections, watched her own career stall afterward as word spread in legal circles that she was difficult, the industry's polite word for someone who refused to look away from wrongdoing. She'd left the legal field 2 years later, unable to find steady work, and eventually landed, humbled and exhausted, in domestic staffing. "I didn't know," she said quietly, staring at the paper. "I didn't know she recognized me. I thought she just didn't like me." "She recognized you the day the agency sent your resume," Julian said. "She's known for 18 months. She hired you on purpose, Adiz. Everything you've endured in this house for the last 8 months was deliberate." Adiz's hands were shaking now, the folder trembling in her grip. 8 months of swallowed humiliation, of biting her tongue, of coming home to Malik with a smile plastered over exhaustion she couldn't explain. All of it had been, from Camille's side, a calculated performance of revenge. "I'm sorry," Julian said, and he meant it with a weight that surprised even him. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry this happened in my home, under my roof, while I was choosing not to ask questions I should have asked months ago." Adiz looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd started working there, She let herself actually study his face instead of keeping her eyes carefully lowered the way years of experience had trained her to. She saw something there she hadn't expected. Not pity, which she would have resented, but genuine, uncomfortable shame. "The engagement is over," Julian continued. "That's not why I'm telling you this, though. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth of what happened to you, and because I want to make something right that has nothing to do with an apology." He slid a second envelope across the counter. Adiz opened it slowly. Inside was a formal offer letter. Not for a maid position, but for a director-level role in his company's compliance department, the exact field her derailed legal career had once been headed toward, at a salary that made her breath catch in her throat. Attached was a handwritten note. "Your instinct for the truth once cost you everything. It shouldn't have. I'd like to help you get back what that cost you, if you'll let me." "I don't understand," Adiz said, voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" "Because 8 months ago, a woman I was about to marry hired someone to clean her cruelty off the floor and called it a job," Julian said quietly. "And that woman turned out to be the only honest person who's worked in this building in years. I think the least I owe you is a chance to be seen for who you actually are." Adiz sat in silence for a long moment, the offer letter trembling slightly in her hands. 7 years of swallowed grief and quiet survival rising in her chest all at once. She thought of Malik at home, asleep with a library book about Saturn's rings open on his chest. She thought of every night she'd cried silently in her car in the parking garage so he'd never see her exhausted. She thought of the woman in the yellow dress pouring wine onto a floor just to watch her scrub. "Yes," she finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll take it." But the story wasn't finished yet. Because 3 days later, Camille Foster would return to that building one final time. Not for her belongings, but for something far more desperate. And what she would say to Adiz in that lobby would reveal a truth even Julian hadn't uncovered. Nobody expected Camille to come back. That was the mistake. 3 days after the engagement ended, Adiz arrived at the Whitfield building for her final week of transition, helping train her replacement before starting her new role the following Monday. She was standing near the concierge desk in the lobby, reviewing handoff notes on her tablet, when she heard heels clicking rapidly across marble behind her. "Adiz, please. I need to talk to you." Adiz turned, every muscle in her body tensing. Camille looked different than she had 3 nights ago. No yellow silk, no confident cruelty, just a woman in a plain coat with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. "There's nothing to talk about," Adiz said, keeping her voice level, though her heart was pounding. "Please. Just 5 minutes. I know what I did I know it was wrong. I know there's no excuse." Camille's voice cracked. "I just need you to know something before Julian's lawyers finish whatever they're planning to do to me." Adiz glanced toward the elevator, considering simply walking away. But something in Camille's desperation held her there. 5 minutes, she said finally. They sat on a bench in a quiet corner of the lobby, an arm's length of careful distance between them. Camille twisted her hands in her lap. "That case 7 years ago," she began. "You probably think my family got away with everything because we had good lawyers. And we did. But it cost me more than you know. My fiancé at the time left me publicly, humiliatingly, the week the news broke. My father stopped speaking to me for 2 years because he blamed me for not catching the fraud sooner, even though I was barely involved. I lost. I lost who I thought I was going to become. And somewhere in there, I decided it was easier to hate the person who'd exposed it than to face what my own family had actually done. That doesn't excuse what you did to me," Adiz said quietly, though something in her chest loosened slightly at hearing the truth spoken aloud after 7 years of silence. "I know," Camille said, tears finally falling freely now. "I know it doesn't. I've spent 7 years telling myself you ruined my life, because it was easier than admitting my family did that to themselves, and I let my anger land on the only person who actually did the right thing that year." She looked up, meeting Adie's eyes directly for what might have been the first time in 8 months. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I deserve that. I just needed you to hear the truth from me before I go." Adie sat with that for a long moment, feeling something complicated shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a recognition that cruelty often grows in the same soil as unhealed pain, even when it never excuses the harm it causes. "I hope you get help," Adie finally said. "Real help. Not because you deserve my sympathy after what you did, but because whatever's broken in you clearly isn't finished hurting people, and the next person might not survive it the way I did." Camille nodded, wiping her face, and stood to leave. At the door, she paused and turned back one final time. "For what it's worth," she said, "you were always better than any of us in that penthouse. I think some part of me always knew that. It's part of why I hated you so much." She walked out into the New York afternoon, and Adie never saw her again. Later, she would hear through distant channels that Camille had moved out of state, entered therapy, and quietly begun the long, unglamorous work of becoming someone different than the woman who'd once poured wine onto a stranger's dignity for sport. Adie sat alone on that bench for several minutes afterward, feeling lighter than she had in 7 years. Not because Camille's apology fixed anything, but because the truth, finally spoken out loud after so long buried, had a way of loosening chains she hadn't fully realized she was still wearing. The following Monday brought a different kind of nervousness, the kind Adie had almost forgotten existed. She stood outside the Whitfield Logistics Compliance Department at 8:45 a.m., wearing a blazer she'd bought secondhand and pressed carefully the night before. Her hands cold with a mixture of excitement and fear that felt entirely unfamiliar after 8 months of dread walking through a different door in the same building. Denise, Julian's longtime assistant, met her at the elevator with a warm smile. "He told me what happened," Denise said quietly as they walked. For what it's worth, half the staff always suspected something was wrong in that house. Nobody knew how to say anything. "I'm glad someone finally did." Adie's new supervisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Nguyen who'd run compliance for 11 years, greeted her with a firm handshake and a stack of case files. "Julian tells me you used to catch discrepancies nobody else noticed," Patricia said. "I've got 3 files here that have been bothering me for weeks. Take a look, tell me what you see." Adie sat down at her new desk, her own desk with her own nameplate, something she hadn't had in 7 years, and opened the first file. Within 20 minutes, old instincts she'd thought long buried under years of scrubbing floors and swallowing insults began waking up, sharp and clear. She found an inconsistency in a shipping manifests dating that Patricia's team had missed for 3 weeks. It was a small thing. Felt enormous. Word moved quickly through the office, the way it always does in workplaces built on gossip and admiration in equal measure. By Wednesday, 2 other directors had stopped by her desk to introduce themselves. By Friday, Patricia had pulled her into a meeting and told her, bluntly, that she wanted to fast-track her for a senior analyst certification the company sponsored. At home, Malik noticed the change before Adie even told him anything specific. "You're humming again," he said one evening, looking up from his telescope diagrams. "You used to hum all the time when I was little. You stopped for a while." Adie paused, surprised her son had noticed something she hadn't even been aware of herself. "I did stop, didn't I?" she said softly, sitting down beside him. "I think I forgot how to for a while." "What changed?" Malik asked, the easy directness only an 11-year-old could manage. Adie thought about how to answer that honestly, in a way an 11-year-old could understand without burdening him with the full weight of 8 months of quiet suffering he'd never known about. "Someone finally asked me who I really was," she said. "And I remembered I liked the answer." Malik seemed satisfied with that, turning back to his star charts. But Adie sat with him a while longer, watching him trace constellations with a careful finger, feeling something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for longer than she'd realized. Long before Camille, long before the wine on the marble floor, long before the case that had cost her a career 7 years ago. It was the feeling of a woman finally standing in a room where her presence wasn't tolerated, but valued. Meanwhile, 3 floors above the compliance department, Julian Whitfield sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports that no longer held his full attention the way they once had. His engagement was over, his personal life quietly unraveling in the tabloids that loved a fallen socialite story, but something unexpected had settled into the empty space where anxiety about Camille used to live, a kind of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He found himself more than once that week, walking past the compliance department on his way to unrelated meetings, glancing through the glass at a woman bent over case files with quiet, focused intensity, and feeling something he didn't immediately want to name. He told himself it was simple curiosity, professional interest in how his newest hire was adjusting. It would take him several more weeks to admit, even to himself, that it was something else entirely. 6 weeks passed, and something neither of them had expected began quietly, carefully taking shape. Started small. Julian would stop by the compliance floor under the guise of checking on a project, and somehow always ended up at Adi's desk. Adi's, for her part, found herself staying a few minutes later than necessary on the evenings she knew he tended to walk through, though she told herself it was purely about finishing her caseload. Neither of them spoke of it directly. There was too much history layered underneath any potential conversation, the imbalance of power that had once existed between them, the raw wound of what she'd endured in his home, the very real question of whether anything built so soon after such an upheaval could possibly be built on solid ground rather than gratitude or guilt. It was Denise, blunt as ever, who finally said what everyone in the office had already noticed. "You two do know the whole floor talks about it, right?" she said to Julian one afternoon, dropping a stack of folders on his desk. "The way you find reasons to be near her. Sweep. It's also not subtle." Julian rubbed the back of his neck, uncharacteristically flustered. "It's not like that," he said, though even he didn't fully believe it. "Isn't it?" Denise raised an eyebrow. "Julian, I've worked for your family for 11 years. I watched you with Camille for 18 months, and I never once saw you look at her the way you look at Adiz when you think no one's watching." That night, Julian found himself standing outside the compliance department long after most of the floor had emptied, watching Adiz pack up her desk through the glass. He knocked softly on the doorframe before he could talk himself out of it. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Adiz looked up, surprised. "Of course." He stepped inside, suddenly aware of how much less composed he felt in this moment than he did negotiating multimillion-dollar shipping contracts. "I want to say something, and I need you to know you can tell me to leave and never mention it again, and nothing about your position here will change. I mean that completely." Adiz set down the folder in her hands, waiting. "I think about you more than I probably should," Julian said honestly. "Not out of guilt. Guilt was there at first, I won't pretend otherwise. But it's not that anymore. I find myself wanting to know what you think about things that have nothing to do with compliance reports. I find myself hoping I'll run into you in the hallway. I haven't felt anything like this in longer than I can remember, and I wasn't sure whether it would be fair to you to say nothing, and let you wonder if you were imagining it, or say something, and risk making things uncomfortable in a workplace where you already deserve to feel completely safe." Adiz was quiet for a long moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Part of her, the part that had survived 7 hard years, that had learned the cost of trusting the wrong situation, wanted to protect herself from the obvious risks of falling for the man who technically still signed her paycheck, whose ex-fiancé had made her life a quiet hell for 8 months, whose world was so far removed from her own reality of budgeting grocery trips and second-hand blazers. But another part of her, quieter and more honest, recognized something in Julian she had not seen in a long time in anyone. A man who had looked at cruelty in his own home and chosen truth over comfort, who had rebuilt a stranger's career out of genuine remorse rather than performative guilt, who was standing in front of her now, vulnerable and unsure, instead of assuming his money and position entitled him to an answer. "I think about you too," Adiz admitted quietly. "I've been telling myself not to. For a lot of reasons. I understand if those reasons are stronger than whatever this is," Julian said. "They might be," she said honestly. "But I'd like to find out together if you're willing to go slowly. Really slowly." Julian smiled, the first fully unguarded smile Adiz had seen from him since the night in the doorway. "Slowly," he agreed. "I can do slowly." Neither of them could have predicted, in that quiet office with the city lights glittering beyond the windows, just how much more complicated the road ahead would still turn out to be. Just when the pieces of both their lives seemed to finally be settling into place, an unexpected obstacle arrived, one that had nothing to do with Camille at all. 6 months into their careful, slowly deepening relationship, Julian's board of directors caught wind of the romance between the CEO and a compliance department employee. What should have been a private matter became, almost overnight, a corporate headache. 2 senior board members, old friends of Julian's late father, called an emergency meeting, citing concerns about optics, potential conflicts of interest, and, though nobody said it outright in the boardroom, a barely concealed discomfort with a black woman who'd started as domestic staff now dating the company's CEO. "It's not personal, Julian," one board member said carefully, the kind of careful that made its own point. "It's about protecting the company's image during a sensitive transition period." Julian, to his credit, didn't raise his voice. But something in his expression went dangerously still. "Say what you actually mean," he said. The room went quiet. "You're worried what it looks like," Julian continued. "That I'm dating someone who used to clean my floors. You're worried about how that plays with certain clients. Say it plainly, or don't say it at all." Nobody said it plainly. Nobody needed to. Julian understood exactly what was happening, and it made something in him. Something that had been quietly reshaped over the past several months by watching Adiz navigate an unfamiliar corporate world with grace, competence, and quiet dignity despite everything she'd endured, harden into absolute clarity. He requested an independent review of Adiz's performance from Patricia Nguyen, who delivered it without hesitation. Adiz had the highest accuracy rate of any analyst hired in the department's history and had personally identified over $2 million in prevented fraudulent shipping losses in her first 6 months alone. Julian presented the review to the board without comment, letting the numbers speak louder than any defense he could offer. But the political pressure didn't disappear, and it began to weigh on Adiz in ways she hadn't expected. She started noticing subtle chilliness from a few colleagues who'd previously been warm. She overheard once a whispered comment in the break room about knowing how to climb quickly, that made her hands shake with a familiar, exhausting anger. Old wounds she thought had scarred over reopened, the same feeling of being seen as less than, of having her competence questioned not despite her hard work but because of assumptions people made before she'd said a single word. One evening, doubt crept in heavily enough that she found herself considering resignation, not because of Julian, but because she was tired, achingly tired, of having to prove her worth over and over in every room she entered, of wondering whether people saw her accomplishments or only her past. She sat Julian down and told him honestly. "I don't regret this," she said, meaning the relationship, meaning the job, meaning all of it. "But I need you to understand something. I've spent my whole adult life fighting to be seen as more than what people assume when they look at me. I can't keep doing that here if it means constantly defending my place at every table." Julian listened without interrupting, without defensiveness, the way she'd come to trust he would. "You're right," he said finally. "And I think I've been quietly hoping this would resolve itself instead of actually standing up and fixing it properly. That's on me, not you." The following week, Julian called an all-staff meeting, something unprecedented for a company his size. He didn't mention Adiz by name directly, respecting her privacy, but he spoke plainly about the company's values, about the fact that competence and integrity mattered more than background or beginnings, about the fact that anyone whispering otherwise in break rooms was welcome to bring their concerns to him directly instead of hiding behind gossip. It wasn't a perfect fix. No single speech could undo years of quiet bias. But it was a clear, public line drawn by the person with the most power in the room, and it mattered. Slowly, gradually, the whispers quieted. Adi's work continued to speak for itself, undeniable and consistent. And something in her relationship with Julian deepened through that difficult stretch, forged in the fire of facing a real obstacle together, rather than simply enjoying an easy honeymoon phase. But the biggest test of all was still ahead of them, one that would arrive in the most unexpected form imaginable. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, in the form of a phone call Adi's almost didn't answer. "Ms. Coleman. This is Riverside Elementary calling about your son." Adi's stomach dropped the way every parent's does at those words. Malik had collapsed during recess. Not seriously, the school assured her, but he'd been taken to the hospital as a precaution after complaining of chest pain and dizziness. Adi's left work so fast she didn't remember the elevator ride down. At the hospital, doctors ran tests through the night while Adi's sat in a hard plastic chair, gripping Malik's small hand, terror clawing at her chest in a way she hadn't felt since he was a newborn struggling to breathe in the NICU 11 years earlier. Julian arrived within the hour, having left a board meeting mid-sentence the moment Denise relayed the message, and sat beside her without a word, simply present, simply there. The diagnosis, when it finally came near dawn, was a previously undetected heart arrhythmia. Serious, but treatable, requiring a procedure and ongoing specialist care that Adi's insurance, new as it was through her recent promotion, only partially covered. The specialist Malik needed, the best in the region for pediatric arrhythmias, had a 6-month waiting list and a price tag that made Adi's carefully rebuilt sense of financial stability crumble instantly. She sat in the hospital hallway that night, exhausted beyond words, doing math in her head that refused to add up no matter how many times she recalculated it. 7 years of struggle had taught her not to expect rescue from anyone. She'd learned to solve her own problems, quietly, alone, without leaning on people who could disappear the moment things got difficult. "Let me help," Julian said quietly, sitting beside her in that hallway. "I can't ask you to do that," Adiz said, old instincts rising fast and hard. "This isn't your responsibility. Malik isn't your. He doesn't have to be my responsibility for me to care about him," Julian said gently. "And you're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference, and I need you to let yourself see it." Adiz sat with that old wall she'd built over years of self-reliance straining against something new. The frightening, vulnerable possibility of actually letting someone stand beside her instead of carrying every burden alone. It went against every hard-won instinct she'd developed since Malik's father had walked out when Malik was 2 years old, since the legal career that fell apart, since 8 months of learning that even asking for basic dignity in someone's home could cost you everything. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly, the words costing her something enormous. "Not just about Malik. About letting myself need you. Needing people hasn't gone well for me." "I know," Julian said. "I'm not asking you to need me. I'm asking you to let me be someone you can lean on sometimes, the way you've let me lean on you these past months, more than you probably realize. That's not weakness, Adiz. That's what this is supposed to look like." Adiz allowed herself finally, after 7 years of solitary survival, to lean her head against his shoulder in that hospital hallway and let a small measure of the weight she'd carried alone for so long shift onto someone else's shoulders too. Malik's surgery, arranged with a specialist within the week through connections Julian quietly activated without a hint of performance or expectation of gratitude, was a success. He recovered fully within a month, already back to sketching star charts and asking increasingly complicated questions about neutron stars before his stitches had even fully healed. And something had shifted permanently in Adiz during that ordeal, not just gratitude toward Julian, but a genuine hard-won willingness to let herself be loved and supported without waiting for the other shoe to drop. 1 year to the day after that terrible night in the penthouse doorway, Julian Whitfield and Adise Coleman stood together in a small garden ceremony, nothing like the extravagant wedding once planned for Camille. Smaller, warmer, filled with people who genuinely mattered to both of them. Malik, 12 years old now and thriving, stood proudly beside his mother as she walked down a simple aisle lined with string lights, wearing a dress she'd chosen herself, not because it was expected, but because it made her feel exactly like who she was. Denise cried through the entire ceremony. Patricia Nguyen gave a toast about instinct and integrity that made half the guests reach for tissues. And in a quiet moment near the end of the reception, Julian pulled Adise aside, away from the music and laughter, just the two of them beneath the string lights. "I keep thinking about that night," he admitted. "How close I came to walking through that door and finding a completely different life waiting for me, one where I never truly saw you at all. I think about how many people walk past someone extraordinary every single day and never actually stop to ask who they are." Adise took his hand. "You stopped," she said simply. "That's what mattered. Not that the moment happened. That you actually saw it, and you didn't look away." She thought, in that quiet moment, of everything the past year had taught her. That dignity survives even in its lowest moments, that the truth eventually finds its way to the surface no matter how deeply it's buried, that real strength sometimes looks like silently scrubbing a floor while refusing to let cruelty steal your sense of self, and that sometimes, against every hard lesson life has taught you to expect otherwise, the person standing in the doorway really does choose to do the right thing. If there's one thing this story leaves us with, it's this. The way people treat those who seem to have no power over their lives reveals more about their character than anything else ever could. And sometimes, the person kneeling on the floor, quietly enduring, carries more strength and grace than anyone standing above them ever will. To everyone watching today, if you've ever felt unseen, undervalued, or like your dignity didn't matter to the people with power over your life, I hope this story reminded you that your worth was never up for someone else to decide. Keep showing up as exactly who you are. The right people will eventually see it. If this story moved you even a little, please hit that like button, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder today that kindness and truth always find their way to the light eventually. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.